This is TWiT.
Very happy to have Daniel Oberhaus. He is the author of a new book. Hello, Daniel. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
His new book is called The Silicon Shrink. Came out in February. It talks about the use of AI in psychiatry. But Daniel's knows Paris because you worked together at Wired magazine. He's also worked at Motherboard Vice and written for many, many, many magazines. His previous book, we won't mention because he wrote it as a child.
Child at the wee age of 23.
At a mere 23. He wrote about extraterrestrial languages, which we will, I think, have to get into. But first, let's talk about the Silicon Shrink. Welcome. It's good to have you here. The premise, as I understand it, is that people should not be using AI for psychotherapy?
Yeah, that's a really great, succinct explanation. I mean, the overall premise is that we shouldn't be using AI in psychiatry writ large. So any sort of mental health application is kind of putting the cart before the horse. Is really the main thesis, that we don't understand mental disorders well enough to automate them at scale. But that's exactly what's happening right now. So it's a bit of a warning about why
it's happening at scale now.
Oh yeah, man.
Correct.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like how?
Well, the therapeutic applications in terms of using them as a therapist, I would argue, is probably one of the more widely adopted ones. So there's tools that have been designed specifically to do that, such as Wobot. But
so are they apps? Is that mostly, or is it actually being
kind
used
of like
in a clinical
character
situation?
AI situation or something else?
Both, yeah. So Wobot would be an example of an app that was designed for therapeutic purposes. What's interesting about Wobot is like it won't call itself a therapist anywhere on this website. That's very intentional. It's a wellness app, but it's functionally it's a cognitive behavioral therapist.
What they're saying though is, there's a lack of therapists, or it takes a long time to get to see a mental health professional. So the implication is that's what you're gonna see,
right?
But it's not. It's an AI.
They've explicitly said it's not meant to be a substitute for a therapist.
Okay.
Yeah. And
so when I say this to people, is most common reaction is, well, not everyone can afford to go to psychotherapy, let alone psychiatry, which is even more expensive. Isn't it better to have an AI shrink than nothing at all?
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of the profound ethical question, right? So this is the primary argument I think made in favor of it, and I'll start by steel manning it, which is there is an acute shortage of mental health professionals. I think something on the order of about 2/3 of U.S. counties don't have a practicing psychiatrist within them, which is wild. But even if you do have access to them, there's a lot of stigma that is wrapped up in seeking mental health services. There's it's challenging to get access. I have lots of friends in New York City who they can afford them. There's plenty of therapists in New York City, and they still can't get access. Yes, and it is expensive.
My therapist is $235 an hour.
So you went for the bargain one.
Yeah, I was going to say that's cheaper than my therapist.
You got grandfathered in.
You're kidding.
Mine on a payment reduction is $250.
Oh my God. Well, it is Petaluma. It's not New York City. So maybe, I mean.
Yeah, you got those small town prices.
Do you know offhand, Daniel, what the mean cost for psychotherapy is?
I don't offhand, although I've never met anyone who has told me it's like, wow, that was so affordable.
No, it's not affordable. And of course, a lot of health plans either don't offer it, or I'm on Kaiser, and they offer psychotherapy or even psychiatry, but they only give you 10 sessions. After that, you're on your own.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
There's a limit to it.
First 10 are free.
I think, can I jump in, Daniel? I just want to say, like, first of all, just compliments on this concept. Like, just the concept of this book is so smart, because I feel like, I wrote this kind of like early worried book about AI in general, sort of, and I touched a little bit on therapy, but that you went deep on this, I think, is such a smart thing. And this notion, you talk about the idea that, first this thing of should we be okay with trying to simulate a service we no longer have, is sort of the industry argument, right? That like, well, nobody is going to do this job, so we need to come in and bring these folks in. And yet, I'm curious what you think. Like, there's the ethical question, but then there's also this question of like, if we start to normalize simulated therapists and using large language models for therapists and so forth, will anyone ever be able to be a human therapist again? Or is that sort of like, do you worry about a downward spiral in which we no longer have human therapists sort of at all at the end of this?
I'm not as worried about that. I appreciate you saying this was a good idea. The kind of an interesting backstory about this book is I started pitching this around, or my agent did, rather. I should give Robert credit there, in 2019. So prior to ChatGPT becoming a thing, and we got in front of all the big four publishers, and they're like, "This is a really interesting subject, but kind of niche. It's maybe good for academics. Like, save it for the university campuses. No, it's like it doesn't have broad appeal. No one cares about this." Then ChatGPT happened, and now actually
Tell me about it, dude.
Yeah,
I had the same timing. We didn't even put AI on the cover of the book because we thought it would be too nerdy.
Yeah. And now it's like I literally just this like a week and a half ago, I was at my barber, and shout out Mark, but he was like, "Hey, have you heard of this thing called ChatGPT?" And I thought he was joking at first. I was like, "Mark, you're like a 29-year-old guy, and you're telling me you just found out about ChatGPT in May of 2025. And he said, yes. And so I was like, okay, well, now I'm dying to know, like, what are you using it for? And he's like, oh, at first just like asking it questions, kind of like messing around with it, having fun. But he's like, I use it almost daily for therapy. And I was like, there's no way, really. Like, and he's like, yeah, so I was like, tell me what you like about it. And, the things you might expect, it's very low cost. It doesn't have the stigma.
Also, there's not a human on the other side who might be judging you.
Yeah.
It's almost in a way, which is both its advantage and disadvantage, impersonal.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, my therapist, I have a relationship with, and I think it's important to have a relationship with your therapist, which obviously you can't have with an AI, but especially for people just starting out, it might be easier to talk to an AI.
Yeah, I mean, I was just at a book festival this last weekend, and I had a woman come up to me afterwards who was like, I think what you're saying is important, but she's like, I just had my husband who has rejected therapy for a long time, and she's like, he needs it. I was like, okay, that's funny. That's funny.
What every wife says, so that's okay. We'll accept
but
that. Yeah,
she's been trying to get him to kind of at least consider it, and so she used ChatGPT as kind of an easy way in, and he really adopted to it to the point where now he's actually open to going to a human therapist.
It got him started talking.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
In a safer way.
Yes, and there's actually
and I
data.
have to point out, I understand there could be downsides. ChatGPT could say, oh, well, really, your life sucks. You shouldn't stick around. But I could see a human therapist, and I know many cases of, first of all, there's no requirement to put up a shingle saying I'm a counselor. So there, you might ask as a potential patient, what's your training? What's your degree? But you don't have to have a degree in it. You don't have to have training in it. And there are plenty of counselors who do have training who might not be very good, who might even be dangerous.
Right. You forget that there's a bell curve of doctors as well, right? Like
same thing with physicians.
There is such thing as the worst doctor in the world, and it might be yours.
The thing is, like, so when there was a study that just came out that showed basically these makers of AI were trying to figure out a benchmark for the degree to which AI tries to suck up to you and make you
sycophantic.
Sycophantic AI, right? And they were trying to figure out the degree to which these models were doing it, because there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that these models will just try to flatter you all the time and reinforce your ideas and And so they used like thousands and thousands of "Am I the asshole" subreddit posts, so the subreddit "Am I the asshole," right, which tells these incredibly embarrassing stories. Did I do something terrible? And
they were doing fake posts, though, right?
No, that was a different subreddit.
They pulled in like thousands of
that was right. Talk me out of it or whatever.
Yeah, right. And what they found was that these models are incredibly sycophantic, and that there is a way. And not only are they very sycophantic, they have no idea how you would fix this problem. And so, to me, one of the things is like, no matter how bad the human therapist is, and there's plenty of bad human therapists, they're at least trained not to just tell you that your ideas are a good idea. They're trained in some way to try and challenge your thinking on this stuff. And
Not all of them.
Or at
Not
least
all
they
of
have,
them.
or at least the
I
ones
hate
that
to
aren't
tell you.
trained have a perspective of some sort.
Right.
They're coming at the conversation with a perspective on the world that is going to shape how they respond to you and how they interpret your responses.
Right.
Versus a chatbot or a large language model powered sort of dynamic is going to be inherently kind of reflexive and sycophantic. I mean, what did you find in your research on this, like about this the nature of this kind of relationship? And I've assumed there are both like there's a promise to it, but then also peril related to this.
Yes. So the research is actually pretty interesting on this, and to kind of go back to an earlier point is DARPA in 2014, they had partnered with the University of Southern California to do a study on exactly this. They brought a bunch of veterans in and ran a study where there was a female presenting therapist avatar. One study group was told that there was a therapist on the other side, and they were basically just interacting through this digital representation of them. And the other one was told there's no person on the other side, you're just talking to a robot. And they were doing a lot of like facial recognition stuff, which is a whole other can of worms in terms of that not actually being a thing. But what they found actually was that the veterans who interacted and knew they were interacting only with an AI actually had better, like they would disclose more information. They actually got more value out of the therapeutic sessions than the veterans that thought they were interacting with a human through an AI avatar, which there's like some, limitations to that study model, but outside of like, and this isn't the only study that has done this, but going back to the very beginnings of the field, there was a researcher at MIT named Joseph Weizenbaum, who in the 1960s, a lot of people are familiar with this, has created this chatbot called Eliza. Yes. And was horrified that people would interact with it as if it were real. And it had this shtick of being a therapist, but people would ask him to leave the room because they would actually want to talk with it. And for him, it was just a way to study human-computer interaction.
Although he did want it to be a kind of a Rogerian therapist,
yes.
right?
But he, to Daniel's point, he quit the field. He was so horrified that he
pissed.
walked away. He was pissed.
And because the thing is, it wasn't even that like advanced. Like I believe the main thing
it was terrible.
Just kind of,
it's like a
it would just
teletype
reflect
machine.
whatever you said back to you.
Yeah,
with
that's
like
basically
a phrase
what it
or two
did.
at the end.
And that's why he said it's like a Rogerian therapist who does, in fact, reflect a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. What do you think about that? What does that tell you? Yeah.
I think so. This kind of comes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. So there's apps that, we should also mention that, the AI therapist is what most people think about when they think about AI in this context. But like, this is a very broad field. It's just kind of like the tip of that iceberg is this application. But within this application, there's apps like Wobot that were designed with the intention of being used for some sort of therapeutic purpose, even if they don't call them therapists. But then there's this other category of things such as ChatGPT that were never intended for therapy that people naturally use them for. And that is truly as old. It's like it started basically with Joseph Weizenbaum, but people have been using Siri for this way. People have been using ChatGPT for this way. There is something so natural about doing this. Like my barber, first thing, what does he do? Like within an hour of having access to this tool, therapist. I don't know what that is. So I people have parasocial relationships with celebrities online. They have parasocial relationships with AI celebrities online, from what I gather now. So there is something about that I find just very, very interesting. The book doesn't go into as much of the kind of the why behind that relationship building, but it does seem to just come so incredibly naturally. But then there's challenges with that, right? So like a very recent news item is the character AI thing with a young man taking his life, and I believe the American Psychological Association is now bringing this to the FTC to investigate. Basically who's at fault for that, because you had mentioned earlier, it's like you don't necessarily need a license to practice as a counselor. You definitely do as a psychiatrist, but even if I go to my therapist, the data I give them is subject to HIPAA restrictions in terms of how they can use that. Most tools that you have access to in the context of AI and psychiatry, they are not HIPAA protected. Your data is just...
Wobot says it is.
Do they say that it's comparable to HIPAA? Because like they're not regulated. They don't actually have to. They're just, saying we're going to abide by that because we're nice. But like they're not regulated.
HIPAA compliant on their front page.
Right, but like he says, that's right. That's marketing more. I mean, they may very well be HIPAA compliant, but they don't have to be.
Right.
under the
Yeah.
terms of
So they could
not being
tomorrow
checked
say,
whether they're
let's
HIPAA
not
compliant.
be HIPAA compliant, and they could really reveal everything to an advertiser or whatever.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting. This kind of touches on I feel like, discuss in the book this concept of like a psychiatric surveillance economy that these tools are enabling. Could you kind of elaborate on what that entails and kind of what impact that could have on like individuals' privacy or autonomy as they kind of use these tools?
Sure. Yeah. And, I'm a big fan of Shoshana Zuboff, who, kind of coined this idea of
Surveillance capitalism. Yeah.
Right. And so the argument was that this is kind of a new front in that. And the core idea here is that when some people hear about AI and psychiatry, their first thought is, well, that sounds bad, but whatever, I'm not in therapy. It's not going to affect me. Like, sucks for the patients, but it's not something that's going to affect me in my day-to-day life. The problem with this is that the way these tools are effective is essentially through dragnet data ingestion. And the reason for that is because we don't know what mental disorders are. Like, psychiatry is the only medical profession that has not a single organic, like, undisputed biomarker for any of the diseases it claims
There's the
to treat.
DSM.
Correct.
I mean, they have a
But I
diagnostic
feel like
manual.
undisputed is the kind of key.
Well,
word,
it's
and
accepted. I don't know
biomarker.
if it's undisputed. Nothing in the world is undisputed.
I mean, I feel like the
roundness of
DSM,
the earth.
even among itself, changes dramatically.
I think there's some real problems with the DSM.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you, but it is an accepted standard for diagnostic.
Well, I would actually,
psychiatric.
I would challenge that. So the National Institutes of Mental Health under Thomas Insel in 2013, they said they weren't going to give grant money anymore to any study that was purely relying on DSM criteria because of how inaccurate it was for diagnostics. So it is the standard, but the way that those diagnoses
Not a very
are
good standard.
well, it's not. It's generally not
We
based
should
on
explain.
evidence.
This is from the American Psychiatric Association. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. If you go to a therapist or a psychiatrist on insurance, they're going to categorize you using the DSM. But for a long time, DSM considered homosexuality, for instance, a mental disorder. There have been all sorts of problems with the DSM.
And it takes forever for things like gambling to get in as an official
Right.
piece of, as an accepted addiction and that kind of thing. It took like
But
30
in a way,
years
that
for them,
underscores my initial point, which is humans are pretty flawed in this too, right? This isn't created by AI. This is created by humans. I feel like you could train an LLM, for argument's sake, to not say things like, well, you're an idiot, or, you should try methamphetamine, but instead to say just encouraging, listening things, and that it would be of therapeutic, because at least Freud thought part of the value of talk therapy is simply talking, right? Not necessarily the therapist's input, but the actual expression of what's going on with you is sufficient. Couldn't an LLM I think Google has an LLM that's supposedly trained to do that. Is that not acceptable? I think that might be a very valuable tool.
It's funny, you guys, I was literally just having a conversation for my podcast moments ago with a psychiatrist who's now a British politician. He's a really interesting guy. And he was the architect of the Good Friday Accords that ended the troubles in Northern Ireland.
Wow.
Fascinating guy named Lord John Alderdice. And he was saying that the key in both individual psychiatry and in trying to get, Protestants and Catholics to sit at a table and agree to not killing each other has to do with being able to express yourself, absolutely, but also being very effectively heard. That once that you have to be heard in a way that feels real to you in order for it to have the true sort of, catalytic quality.
Right.
And for me, that's the thing that it feels to me like AI doesn't do, right? Is this feel? I mean, maybe it does. I don't know. Maybe we
know it doesn't, right? Because we know how it works. But if it feels like it does,
maybe it feels that, until I said it, I hadn't even really thought of that. Maybe especially to a certain generation of people, like maybe that's maybe you feel heard in a way that you don't with humans if you've sort of grown up in that generation or the rest of it.
I have a close family member who's bipolar under good psychiatric treatment. She's doing very well. She talks to her chatbot. She has a therapist and a psychiatrist, but she talks to her chatbot and really gets a lot out of it. If I thought it was dangerous for her, and it could be because, she's bipolar, I would say you can't do that. But I think she gets a lot out of it.
Daniel, just to ask you a question here, you have this really cool concept in the book that I really appreciate, which is this idea that somehow we're going to wind up in a kind of digital asylum situation. And you use that term asylum as this sort of symbol of where things could go wrong. And I just think it's so interesting, this notion, because I bump into this all the time as a tech writer, and I know you think about this too, that this thing of, if we make a better, a more efficient, more cost-effective digital solution to a thing, and you wind up kind of giving up on the harder human version of it because you've achieved marginal utility by making something digital, are you sort of, are you giving up in a way that's bad is sort of my question. And in this case, I just want to hear you talk a little bit about this notion of creating a kind of asylum, which for me, as I understand it, is sort of this idea that we're somehow going to warehouse people with these digital tools rather than actually making sure we address them in effective ways. Am I understanding that concept right?
Yeah, and it comes back to what Paris was speaking to earlier about the psychiatric surveillance economy, and so kind of close the loop there. The challenge with a lot of these tools right now is we don't have a good understanding of what data is going to, or actually, I'll unpack this a little bit more. So the reason why a lot of psychiatrists and people in the mental health profession find the idea of using AI so attractive is because if you go to a mental health provider, assuming that you're not in an inpatient facility, you're likely going to see them maybe for 1 hour a week. Maybe you can talk to them on the phone or text them, whatever, but it's relatively little context. So the therapist or the mental health professional, we'll just use psychiatrist as shorthand, has a very limited data set. And when you come to the, an outpatient meeting, for instance, you're relying on the patient's recall. How was your last week been? How have you been feeling, et cetera? And so there's, surveys you can send out for momentary ecological assessments, for instance, to kind of get more in situ data. But the vast majority of the time that you are awake, you have no data on that patient, how they're feeling, their behaviors, their thought patterns, et cetera. What's nice about AI is we all walk around with a pretty sophisticated computer in our pocket right now, and we're just bleeding off all of this digital exhaust all the time. And so the thinking around a lot of the kind of push for AI and psychiatry is that we can use this data that we're generating, because most people are spending a significant amount of time every single day in front of a digital network device. And this data, even if it's not what am I writing into the computer, it might just be my typing speed or my scrolling speed. And these things that are almost happening at a subconscious level might hold clues to my mental state and my mental health. It's a really appealing idea. There's very little data to back it up that it works. And in fact, the NIMH former chief, who was there for about 10 years, his name was Thomas Insel, he left to go work at Google to pursue this idea. And then he launched a company called MindStrong to pursue this idea. It's the most well-capitalized startup in history, raised $100 million. And in 2023, it completely shut down. And they never said why. Wow. Presumably it's not because of how well it worked. And so there was very little data this entire time about this. And so the challenge right now is that is a very attractive idea. If that works, I'm all for it, but we don't know what data is going to have the best read in terms of actually measuring my mental health so I can correlate it with perhaps a diagnosis. How do I know that I'm about to enter into a crisis? So you basically have to be monitoring everything I'm doing all the time around the clock to make sure that A, I don't have a crisis while you're not watching. And then B, maybe it turns out that my typing speed was the X factor that you can map to the, it correlates very highly with major depression, but we don't know that. So right now we're kind of just hoovering up everything and seeing what matches best and trying to fit the box around this person. So that's kind of the surveillance economy aspect of it. And then to the asylum piece, that's kind of an interesting historical analogy in the sense of asylums, prior to roughly the 19th century, the way that the mentally ill, what they would have called people with madness, were basically just warehoused. They were put in prisons. They were cared for. If they were rich, by kind of they just hire a benefactor to put them in a outhouse somewhere where they were kept away from polite society. Then in the 19th century, around the Enlightenment, a bunch of, I think, people with very good intentions said, well, hey, maybe we can use the asylum for therapeutic purposes, and we can actually use it as a place for rehabilitation. people in prisons were thinking about the same thing. And it's just like, it shouldn't have a custodial function. It should have a healing function. That went really, really well for a few decades. And then people just kept coming, and the asylums essentially became overwhelmed. And so the number of patients in the asylum in the US hit its peak in the 1930s, I believe. You'll have to check me on that. But like pretty late into the game in the 20th century, before the population started declining. And then there was, of course, the turnout of all the patients around the Kennedy administration with disastrous results that we're still dealing with today. But the asylum basically became a victim of its own like good intentions, in the sense of it just became overwhelmed, and it was no longer able to fulfill its therapeutic purpose, and essentially reverted back to a custodial function. And so I think something similar is happening now. It's just much harder to see because it's not physical. But these algorithms are beginning to be run on any sort of institutional computer, right? So like you're seeing suicide detection algorithms in K through 12, you're seeing them in colleges, you're seeing them in government institutions, you're seeing them in offices, because happy workers, it turns out, are actually more efficient. So you can say it's for their mental health, but really it's because you'll get better products. But like judgments aside, these things are being implemented on our computers. And you can say, well, maybe I don't work in an institution. Like this doesn't affect me. If you use Facebook, it does, because they have a suicide algorithm monitoring you too. Not if you're in the EU, because they banned it due to privacy reasons. But if you're in the US, they do. So it is there. It's already here. And it's only
they're doing that to try to mitigate
correct
teenage suicide, though. I mean, is it ineffective?
We don't know. They don't publish the data.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing that we all worry about, right, is that they might, like, my worry is that, like, because the market incentive is there to adopt it, because it's just so much easier to deploy 1 million digital therapists than it is to train and deploy human therapists, that we're going to sort of do that, and by the logic of Silicon Valley, just kind of like, iterate as we go, before we even know whether that's effective.
Yeah, moving fast and breaking things isn't so hot if you're breaking people.
Yeah, that's the thing I worry about.
But what is the cause? Do we know what the cause of the therapist shortage is? Is it something we can fix?
That's a great question. There's several contributing factors. One is it's a pretty brutal job. Like when you think about what a therapist is doing all day, you're basically a receptacle for people's problems, which could vary from very day to day kind of just the living or the worried well, I think is what Freud called them, to people who maybe they're harboring suicidal ideation, maybe they're the victims of abuse, maybe they're abusing others. So you're dealing with just heavy shit professionally. So not very attractive from that. So there's a huge rate of clinician burnout.
Of course, you could say the same of police officers. We don't have a lack of police officers.
I actually
payment,
don't know.
I think, is also a big problem, I would assume.
Yes.
Is police officers get salary and overtime. Therapists are typically beholden to an hourly rate.
Yeah.
They have to hustle, try and figure out how to make it work with insurance. They have to deal with reimbursement. They have to deal with the fact that clients can't really pay.
I know a lot of therapists and a lot of very
an
happy
hour.
therapists who are working very well. My ex-wife was a therapist. It takes a certain kind of person. My guess is that there just aren't that many people who would be good at it or would want to do it. Even if you funded it, even if you promoted it, even if you had college programs and everybody said, this is a great job, there just aren't that many people who have the skills to do it or the desire to do it. Would be my guess.
I mean, here in California, they had to create a whole other category called a marriage and family therapist.
Yeah, my ex-wife was an MFT. Yep.
And an MFT, right, that's a specific California thing. You can't practice in other countries, in other states. They created it because of this huge shortage. I mean, I'm looking at the American Counseling Association site. They're saying lack of funding, poor reimbursement rates, low retention, huge need.
She had to get a master's degree. She had to pass an exam. She had to have many, many hours in training with an accomplished psychotherapist working with her to get the MFT. Actually, she had an MFCC initially. So it is not the kind of thing you hang out a shingle and the next day you're taking patients.
Yeah, I certainly don't mean to suggest that she's not legit. I'm just saying that it's a reflection of how desperate California was.
Yeah, but it's still
create a slightly easier way of getting as many people.
Still wasn't that easy. Let me just. I just want to say it was a good qualifying process, I would say, and a lot of people probably wouldn't get through it. It's also expensive, by the way, because you have to get a master's.
Yeah.
It's funny. I'm actually because I'm in this funny moment where I'm no longer a full-time journalist, I've been thinking like, what do I do with myself? And I started looking at being a therapist.
I saw you're a fellow at Stanford in behavioral sciences.
I did a fellowship there as a journalist, and that got me thinking about it. But yeah, thinking about like becoming a therapist. Turns out it's such a hard road. It didn't, my wife looks at the numbers. She's a much more practical person than I do, and she was like, these numbers don't make any sense for our.
I think you'd have to have a calling. Honestly, to be a good one anyway. And the good therapists I know, they have a calling. It's like, it's like being a priest. It's like you have to really have that nature and want to be of service. And it is a sacrifice. I'm sure it's I can't imagine doing it. And it takes a lot of training to be a good one. So the reason I ask is I suspect we're never going to have enough.
Yeah.
So maybe there is some way to use AI Daniel, is there any safe way to do this?
Yeah. And so there's like a few points that I really want to make sure I clarify. One is that this isn't a book, and it's not my opinion at all, that people just shouldn't use them, full stop, right? So like, for instance, your family member, I know lots of people who do this, by Barber included. And I'm not here to tell them don't. In the same way that I wouldn't tell someone, hey, don't take the pills that your psychiatrist gave you, right? But what I will say is like, hey, we actually do have a massive overdiagnosis problem that has led to a massive uptake in psychiatric drug use. Maybe that was out of best interest. Maybe that was out of industry interest. It doesn't really matter. Like, the fact is, there are a lot of people on psychiatric drugs now. But what's interesting about that is the results have gotten worse over the past 20 years. Yeah. This is the only medical specialty, once again, where as it progresses, the outcomes are getting worse for patients. That's shocking. We spend billions and billions of dollars doing this. I don't think it has anything to do with the intentions or the capabilities of therapists and people who work in this. I have nothing but very, very deep respect for them. So I just wanted to say, like, I don't, like, people ask me this all the time now. It's like, I don't think that you just shouldn't use it, but I do think you should like read, what's on the tin. What am I going to get from this? What are the risks? What are its limitations? I think that's very important to know, and it's often very lost. Like, we were just looking at Wobot's website, and it'd be very hard to tell that wasn't it wasn't regulated as a HIPAA compliant organization. It is HIPAA compliant, that is true, but there's this kind of unspoken thing about, but like, we don't have to. And so that's the kind of thing where this was more meant to be kind of like a shot over the bow, be like, this is happening, this is real. I'm the last person who's going to say that there aren't people getting benefits from this. There's definitely people getting benefits from this. And I think that's fantastic. I also think, to your point, Leo, can we use these things effectively? My answer is like an optimistic kind of yes, I think. What was so interesting about writing this book is this is an issue that has become very topical because of ChatGPT. But it's about 70 years old, and it goes right back to the beginning of artificial intelligence as a field. And in fact, Carl Sagan in the 1970s wrote an article for Natural Science where he predicted a future where there would be like almost telephone booth therapists to deal with a therapist shortage in his day, 50 years ago. So it's definitely not going away. The tools have gotten better. And I think what's really interesting about everyone kind of indexes on AI therapy. Like, the book covers a lot of different technologies, and there are certainly a lot of other ones that I think are much more nefarious. But as far as AI therapy goes, most of the AI therapists are implemented as cognitive behavioral therapists. And what's interesting about CBT is when you really zoom out about what it's trying to do, a lot of people, I think, look at therapists as like almost gurus, but like, that's not what they are. They're actually teaching you how to help yourself, right? Like, they are giving you the tools to improve the way you think, to improve your behaviors in ways that are like less maladaptive and increase your overall well-being. That's what a good CBT therapist should do. And to the extent that that's what they're there for and what they're trying to achieve, the programming for CBT is actually, it lends itself very well to being implemented in an algorithm. In the same way that we were talking about Rogerian's therapists, that was a little bit more hacky, what Joseph Weizenbaum was doing. But as a way of delivering care, CBT is actually very primed for application in LLMs. There's, we're pretty early days here, but I think that's phenomenal if that works out and we can get people care and it's proven to be effective. My question right now is, why can't anyone show me data saying that this is at least as good as a human therapist? Because the pushback I usually get is it's better than nothing, but then I say, can you prove that? And the answer is no, you actually can't. There's no data showing that because, like, for instance, I was just talking to the New York Times a few weeks ago about K through 12 suicide monitoring platforms, right? And you're like, how could that possibly be something that anyone would ever be like, hey, wait a second, we may not want that. It's like, it almost sounds like you're advocating for children killing themselves. And it's like, that's not what I'm advocating for at all. But there's this tendency to say we must do this because it might save one life. And that is a philosophical and a moral argument you can make. And lots of people do. But there's also lots of people that say, hey, maybe we shouldn't all just be forced to like participate in these systems just because one person thinks it might help a kid, because we actually don't know like if that would have happened regardless. There's just so little data, and the companies that are building these aren't forthcoming with it at all. I don't know if that's because the data suggests that maybe it isn't as effective as they would want you to believe, or if it's just not, if it just doesn't exist yet. My experience with tech companies is when they have data that shows their thing works, they want to tell you about that.
They would let you know. Yes.
Yeah.
There will be 7 press releases
Yes.
and a web conference.
Yes. So it's very curious that we're missing that. And, you know, if you go on these sites and look at them, a lot of the sites will have data and it'll say, you know, they'll make some very large claims. But if you actually click on the peer-reviewed research that they are claiming backs it up, what you'll find is, for instance, there was a chatbot that was claiming, it had these massive mental health benefits for college students with depression. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe we found one that worked. And then I went to look at the study, and what they were actually showing was that this chatbot was better than a government pamphlet in a cohort of about 50 college students over 2 weeks. That's not nothing, but like, I don't know. It's not really what you're saying on the website either, right? Like, you're
better than a pamphlet.
Right. I was like, okay,
People
well,
will, tell that to investors.
yeah, I'm willing to believe that actually, that it is better than a pamphlet. I'm less willing to believe that you are just across the board, like lowering depression rates by 50%. It was like something very grandiose like that, but that was the case, but only with that very important asterisk. And so there's a lot of that in this field. And that's
the thing that is so disturbing to me about this world that you're covering in this book, right? Is that, like, in the United States particularly, this kind of thing is a business, whereas in other countries it's a civic service, it's a national service. Your therapist is not you go to your national health service in the UK or other places for your behavioral therapy or whatever else you're going to need. It's only here where everything's privatized that we would even consider that we would need a digital replacement for this stuff. And then we're all just kind of like hostage to the marketing, to how truthful the marketing is. It's so cynical.
It's shocking to me. So, like, to take Woebot, for instance, I feel like I pick on them. I actually have no beef with Woebot. It's just like probably the most well-known one, but they are currently doing a FDA trial. And what's surprising to me about that is most things that have to go through an FDA trial, you cannot access them prior to going
the clinical
trial
approval. Yeah.
So is it like, is this a medical technology? Because like what's going through the trial is the exact same thing I can go download on Google Play. So what changed? So, like, I basically just have access to an unregulated medical technology, and the reason I do is because you're not saying it's medical, but you are, like, you aspire to that, and that's shocking to me that you can do that. So I don't know. The UK is actually an interesting example because the NHS is also increasingly doing this. They have a pretty robust tech sector that's building stuff here for the same reasons, right? It's therapist shortages, but I think the number 2 and number 3 chat therapy bots are actually UK based.
Interesting.
That is interesting.
I understand the difficulty here. You should absolutely read Daniel's book because it goes into a lot more depth than we could possibly go into in half an hour. But it's, by the way, called The Silicon Shrink: How Artificial Intelligence Made the World an Asylum. It came out last month or a couple months ago and is available on Amazon, as you can see, and Kindle or hardcover, and at your favorite bookstore, which you should absolutely patronize. But I feel like, you don't want to experiment with people's psyche. That's a very dangerous thing to experiment with. Of course, we also experiment with full self-driving in vehicles. Also dangerous. AI is involved in a lot of things. We're going to talk about some. Very dangerous. But at the same time, there is a need. We know there's a need. We know that in some cases it's useful. I don't think there's a clear answer on this one. I know you don't say don't do it, but I think it's important to think about the consequences of doing it. I just don't know if there's a clear answer. Like, is this a bad way? I feel like we need to look at it and think about it and move forward judiciously.
I feel like that's a possible answer, is like that it needs to be
I wouldn't throw it out.
Actually thought about.
Would you throw it out?
No. I mean, I think that most things exist somewhere in grayscale rather than all black or all white.
Well, one thing I get out of this book is that you know, we have come to at least expect in the United States that when someone offers you a therapy, it has been tested and validated in some form, that if you go to a licensed medical professional, they've been through some sort of training, and that your data will be kept private. What I think, Daniel, you've made such a good case on in this book is like, those things don't apply to this sector.
Right.
And we're, you know, as I'm sure we'll discuss later in the hour or later in the show, you know, the budget bill that Congress is looking to pass right now would forbid states from regulating AI in any way for a decade. So the regulation of this kind of thing wouldn't even really be possible if, you know, under state law down the line if that bill goes through. So like, we're living in this world where it's totally unregulated. And to me, if there's nothing else here, it suggests to me that some standards should be imposed on what is currently a totally Wild West.
Yeah, and I think to close the loop on this, like I'm very strongly in agreement with what you had said, Leo, because like I think the book is largely focused on what is the risk of if we do this and we don't put a check in, right? But I think the reason why this is a problem at all is because there's a lot of well-meaning people who say, what is the risk if we don't? Like, if we must do something. The problem is that's like the famous politician's fallacy, right? Like, we must do something. This is something. Therefore, we must do this. And it's like,
right.
That's where I'm like, this is one tool in the toolkit. And all I'm saying is like, let's withhold judgment right now. Like, these exist. They're all around you already. Let's take a beat. And all I'm asking is like, please just show me the data. Like, does this work as advertised? And the answer is like, it either doesn't exist or there no one is showing it to you. And so
it's hard though. This is hard data to produce. I mean, it's not.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah. You know, I think we have a little bit of a crisis going. We have 2 school nurses for 1,500 students in my little town. Mm-hmm. That's not adequate. And we celebrate it because we've got 2. Mm-hmm. So we have a problem. I would, you know, it'd be nice to say, everybody go be a therapist to your friends and neighbors. Go talk to them so they're not talking to robots. There are lots of things we could do. We should probably be doing them. And I'm not sure AI is the solution. And you aren't saying it, but I will say it. The sad thing is AI has also become a gold rush. And there are a lot of people out there trying to make a lot of money on any possible use of AI because it's easy to raise money for it. And which means there will be a lot of bad actors involved in this space and every other. And in this space, the hazards are great. So that is something else to be very aware of. Daniel, I want to thank you so much for your time. Daniel Oberhaus.
Thank you.
The book is The Silicon Shrink, and well worth reading. I thank you for your time, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah,
thanks,
thank you so much. Appreciate the interest and the time.
Thank you.
Have a great one.
Buddy.
Take care.
See you guys.
Hey, it's Leo Laporte. I hope you've enjoyed this little clip from our programming at twit.tv. For more, visit our website, twit.tv, or subscribe in your favorite podcast client. There's also a link somewhere down there.